Hello, friends, and welcome to the PrepWell podcast. I'm your host, Phil Black. And if you have an 8th, 9th, or 10th grader with big aspirations, like the Ivy League, or military service academies like West Point, ROTC, or athletic scholarships, boom, you've come to the right place. My specialty, my superpower, if you will, is preparing families for these competitive programs. I'll teach you what your child should do, when they should do it, and how you can help. So stick around and prepare to out-prepare. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the PrepWell podcast. Today, I'd like to talk about what you should do if you don't think you'll get into an Ivy League school or a near Ivy League school. And I'm not suggesting that this should be everybody's goal, but in my experience, that seems to be where most people start. They start at the highest level of selectivity, and then they move down tiers of selectivity until they find the range of colleges where they think they might fit in. And when I refer to the Ivies or near Ivies, I'm talking about a very select group of schools. That would include typically the 8 Ivy League schools and a few others, like MIT and Stanford and some of the service academies like the Naval Academy. Basically, the 10 most selective schools. Now, notice that I didn't say the top 10 best schools, because who's to say what school is best for you? I'm talking about the schools that are the toughest to get into. And I may, for ease of communication, refer to these schools as top 10 schools, but don't take that the wrong way. It doesn't necessarily mean that I think they're the best schools, but rather very difficult to get into. These are the schools that typically have low single-digit acceptance rates. We're talking 3%, 4%. They're schools with very strong brand recognition in the marketplace and high prestige throughout the world. And for these reasons and more, they're very difficult to get into. And I talk quite a bit in this podcast and inside PrepWell Academy's online program about how to position yourself to get into schools like this, if that's something that you aspire to. But the fact of the matter is that 95% of the students that apply to these schools, even the most qualified students, still don't get in. So today, I want to talk about what you should be thinking about if Ivy League and near Ivy League schools are not on your radar, or you don't get into any of them, either because you're not interested in what they have to offer, or you're doubtful about whether you would get into one of these schools, or some other reason. And when you consider the odds, almost everybody should count themselves in this camp because it's so difficult and unpredictable to get into one of these 10 schools. Why don't we start with why the top 10 most selective schools are so in demand in the first place? Well, there are many reasons, but one reason is that their name recognition and reputation in the marketplace is so strong that it almost doesn't matter how well you perform at the schools. Your GPA, for example, or what you major in, because employers and the general public will recognize immediately that you went to a high prestige college. And they take that as a signal that you're a highly qualified candidate and an accomplished person. They essentially use colleges as a filtering and sorting or a credentialing service that helps them quickly identify students who have a proven track record of high performance. It makes their job easier. Does this mean that every student coming out of these 10 schools is better than someone from another school? No, of course not. But it does put an added burden on the student who didn't go to one of these schools to work harder to prove themselves. The students from the top 10 schools have a head start. It's not something that can't be overcome with hard work and a laser focus on what you want. There are countless examples of this, but it will typically require more time, more effort, and more attention. So if we're to assume that you don't get into one of these top 10 schools and you don't have that immediate, no questions asked credibility in the marketplace, how should you think about what college to attend? What's the difference between going to a tier 1 school, maybe we'll call that the top 10 in terms of selectivity, and a tier 2 school, maybe that's schools ranked 11 through 40, or a tier 3 school, schools ranked somewhere 41 to 100? Well, in my opinion, you can agree or disagree, there's a pretty dramatic drop after the top 10 schools. When you move to school ranked number 11, 12, 14, 20, the number 31st ranked school, meaning if you don't make it into that super selective top 10 tier, I'm not sure that it matters all that much whether you go to the 11th ranked school or the 25th or the 32nd ranked school. They all tend to blur together. Can anyone really articulate any difference between going to Emory over Tufts or Boston University over Middlebury or Northeastern over Lehigh? Now, in the micro, yes, of course, there are differences in what these schools are known for and how well they're respected in their region. But in the macro, the big picture, is there really that much difference? Think about it. If you were assessing 3 candidates for a job, and the candidates came from MIT, William and Mary, and SUNY Binghamton, wouldn't you be biased, consciously or subconsciously, to expect, quote unquote, more out of the person from MIT? You're not wrong if you make this assumption. It's just human nature. We all know the reputation of MIT and how selective they are, and how the average SAT math score is 800, which is perfect. And we aren't quite as sure about William and Mary graduates or SUNY Binghamton graduates. That's not to say that the MIT person is always the better hire or the better fit, but that student typically has a pretty healthy head start. So what's my point here? My point is that if you are not destined for a top 10 school, then I wouldn't care so much about whether you go to a school ranked 13th or 33rd or 52nd. And by the way, I'm throwing around the term rankings here as if there's an actual ranking system that everyone agrees on, which there is not. And we're not going to get into the weeds now on the different ranking lists and the systems and how they come up with those. The objective factor that I'm talking about here is acceptance rates, because that's a number, rightly or wrongly, that's highly correlated to prestige and brand and name recognition. So if we zoom out, we can all probably agree that there are about 10 schools that typically, year after year, indisputably rank in the top 10. And the 8 Ivy League schools are usually among these 10, mostly because of the branding of the Ivy League. And if one of these 10-ish schools is not in your future, then you should open your mind to all schools, from the number 11th ranked school to the 1100th ranked school. And you should not necessarily try to find a school that's as close to the top 10 as you can, even though I know that's tempting to do. Instead of trying to get into that school or attend that school with the highest quote unquote ranking, which can be arbitrary and change every year, instead, I want you to think about these 2 factors. Number 1, cost, and number 2, career interests. Cost and career interests. Let's address cost first. The dirty little secret about schools ranked 11 through, say, 50 or 60 is that many of them cost about the same as the top 10 schools. In many cases, they might cost more than some of the top 10 schools because of the generous need-based financial aid packages that the top 10 schools can typically offer. And by cost, just so we're all on the same page here, I'm talking about $80,000 a year. $80,000 a year. That's a lot of money. Now, some people think that going to a top 10 school is worth that hefty price tag because of the advantages that we've talked about, and there are others. And of course, this is up for debate. But what about a school that's ranked number 22? Is that school still worth $80,000 a year or more? I don't know. It depends on your financial situation. If money is no object, then maybe it's worth it. But if you'll have to take out $150,000, $200,000 in student loans, then I would think twice. Is that number 22 school really worth the price? Is there an ROI there? Is there a return on investment? if you don't get the reputational and the prestige pop that you usually get from a top 10 school, then is it prudent to take on such high levels of debt? Well, what were your other choices? How about going to an in-state public school that's half as expensive? Is the number 22 ranked out-of-state private liberal arts college really $25,000 more valuable per year than the number 39 ranked local public state school? That's a tough call. That's a $100,000 difference over 4 years. If you did have that type of money, you might wonder whether you should attend the number 22 school and have zero money left when you graduate, or would you rather go to the number 39 school and have $100,000 in cash in your pocket? Now, if money is an issue and going $200,000 into debt will significantly affect your life, your choice of major, and what types of jobs you will entertain after graduation, then maybe it's not worth it. The stress alone of having so much debt weighing you down might not be worth it. Is an extra 11 points on this theoretical ranking scale really worth it? If the debt is going to force you to take a job that you don't want, or major in something that you're not that interested in, or force you to live like a pauper for 4 years in college, eating ramen noodles every night? If that's going to be your lifestyle, then think hard about that. And if you're not in that top 10 zone, the differences among colleges get pretty thin. Most offer very similar programs of study. So after first considering cost, the second most important factor to consider is your career goal or your career interests. Because remember, if you get into a top 10 school, your major preference and career interests aren't quite as big a deal. It's one of the many advantages of going to one of these schools. It doesn't really matter what you major in, because employers and people out in town will immediately hear the name of your school and assume that you can do anything. Now, that may or may not be true, but that's the reality. So if you go to a school outside of that top 10 tier, in addition to looking at cost, it would behoove you to do a bit more soul searching up front about what you might want to do with your life after college in order to help you figure out what type of college you should attend. And the more specific you are about what you're interested in, the easier this will be. If you know you want to be a finance major, for example, on your way to a job in banking, then you can quickly narrow down the universe of schools that have a strong finance program. Boom. If you're interested in studying classics, same thing. It makes your college search easier if you can narrow it down by schools with strong classics programs. If you have zero idea of what you want to do, it makes the search more challenging. Let me give you a fictional example. Let's say you don't end up getting into one of these top 10 schools, quote unquote, and you're trying to figure out your next best choice. Let's talk about option A. I'm going to call option A the lazy option. This is where you look at the 8 schools that you did get into, and you immediately and intentionally pick the one that's ranked the highest. Let's say you got into Vanderbilt, which is, say, number 15 on some ranking somewhere. And the sole reason you decide to go to Vanderbilt is because it had the highest ranking of all of your options. You didn't care how much it would cost. Let's say it's $80,000 a year. You didn't care whether it had the major that you were interested in. You simply wanted to go to the school with the highest published ranking, and you'll figure out all that major and career stuff sometime down the road. That's option A. Option B, let's call this the more pragmatic option. In this scenario, you realize that your local state school only costs $28,000 a year, and that there's significant merit scholarships available that might bring that cost down another $10,000 a year. And since you've spent a lot of time thinking about what you might want to major in and what career that might lead to, you've narrowed down your major preference to 2 choices. And that state school has fantastic programs for both of those major choices. But that state school is only ranked number 40 in that same ranking. What would you do? Do you blindly gravitate toward the school with the highest quote unquote ranking, despite the high cost and the unexplored academic programs? Or do you consider the quote unquote lower ranking school that's far more affordable and has the exact program of study that you're interested in? My hope, and the reason for this podcast, is that you would strongly consider option B and not simply go hunting for the highest ranked school that you get into. So let me try to bring all this home. If you have the opportunity to go to an extremely selective college, I typically cut this off at about the top 10, but you can define that any way you like, and you can afford it, then by all means go. Even if you're not quite sure what you want to major in or what your ultimate career path might be. Using that one metric, selectivity, as your primary determining factor, assuming you can afford it, is not a terrible strategy, because these schools will put a lot of wind in your sails. However, if getting into one of these schools is not in the cards for you, then please be open-minded. Consider the cost, and consider trying to find a school that has a program of study that aligns with what you think you might want to do long term. And don't just reflexively choose the school that's highest in the rankings. So for all you seniors out there, this should be your mindset as you start to get admissions answers in December for those of you who applied early, and in March for those of you who applied regular decision. And I wish you luck. That's all I've got for you today, folks. Thank you for tuning in. If you know a parent with an 8th grader, 9th grader, 10th grader, 11th grader, 12th grader in high school that might find this helpful, please share the episode with them. You can do that by finding the small box with the tiny arrow that points up. That's the share button. Click that button, text your friends the link to this episode, put a little note in there from you recommending that they give it a listen. Of course, if you have questions, comments, or an idea for an upcoming episode, please don't hesitate. Reach out to me by email, DM me on Instagram. Check out our blog, Facebook, connect with me on LinkedIn. I would love to hear from you. Until next week, goodbye, good luck, and never stop preparing. This podcast is brought to you by PrepWell Academy. PrepWell Academy is my one-of-a-kind online mentoring program that delivers to your 9th or 10th grader a short, highly relevant video from me every week, every Sunday, in fact, where I give them a heads up about what they should be thinking about to stay ahead of the game. To get these valuable lessons into your child's hands, please head over to prepwellacademy.com and enroll your child today.